My name is Jonathan Edwards. Good afternoon. We'd like to thank SHARE and Society for Community Research and Action for hosting this conference, Peer Support Workforce Bridging Research to Practice. I'm really pleased to be joined by Rita Cronice, Gita Enders, and Doctors Joanne Forbes, Carlos Pratt, and Amy Spagnolo. And of course, again, I'm Jonathan Edwards. Following our presentation, The Future of Peer Support Supervision, Findings from Participatory Action Research, you will learn a bit more about each of the presenters from Dr. Amy Spagnolo. So our agenda for today is to acknowledge the people with whom this research would not be possible. We have some engagement questions just to warm the room up a bit, even in a virtual space. We'll review our learning objectives, share with you our project milestones, which we're really proud of. We'll share our research question and specific aims of this research. And then we'll do a quick review of the 5 functions of supervision, which is the model around which this research is based. We'll share our literature review, the methods for conducting the research that we'll present today, considerations for practical application. So that's the takeaway that we hope you all feel like you're leaving with a swag bag of information and something to be actionable and hands-on in your practice starting tomorrow or today. And then we'll have some final polling questions and an opportunity for you to contribute further to the development of this research, given its spirit of participatory action research. And we have left some time to have a discussion, and you'll also hear about a very special project that many of us have worked on, and we'll be able to hear about that from one of our presenters, Rita Cronice. So before turning this over to our next presenter, Gita, as I said earlier, this research would not be possible without the focus group participants, who were 26 peer support supervisors. Of course, peer support specialists helped us. They reviewed and they provided feedback on supervisor competencies. And we would also like to thank the Academy for Peer Services staff, who helped us with the data management and organization with this project. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gita.
Classically, I'm always muted. Thanks, Jonathan. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for coming. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions. If you'll put your answers in the chat, as Jonathan said, let's do a little warm up. So the first question I have is, what comes to mind when you think about advocacy as an element of supervision? What comes to mind when you think about advocacy as an element of supervision? Please put your reactions in the chat. Career growth for peer staff. I love it. Yes. That's a big one. Do we have perhaps other nuanced? Ensuring organization follows peer standards, peer leadership. I think we're hearing from some peers in the House. I mean, I'm a social worker and a certified peer specialist. Communication. Advocating for the, thank you, Jason. Fighting stigma. Mentorship, equitable salaries. Supervisors can definitely, hi Aviva, can definitely advocate for all of that. Peer drift or co-optation, definitely. And promoting the best they can be. Scott Myers, safe environment. I always think of that in two forms. I think about personal safety and professional safety. Housing would be great. Wow, I don't want to take up too much. Let's roll the next question. Thank you all. Rita, definitely. So this is maybe a little more concrete. What comes to mind when you think about evaluation as an element of supervision? Evaluation as an element of supervision. Co-evaluation, absolutely. Hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about that. feedback and support. I know in my practice, I share, well, let me not go there. We're talking about what you think about evaluation. Sandwich method, I call that praise, polish, praise. Absolutely. Go to strengths first. Wonderful idea. Mutuality and feedback for the supervisor and the supervisee. Transparent criteria. Thank you, Lydia. It's been a while. And self-evaluation should come before evaluation. And I was going to speak to that. I hope everyone is providing that opportunity. I don't know how our time is, but why don't we have a look at the learning objectives? So we have a big mandate. Thank you, Scott. So we're going to be talking about the 5 functions of supervision model that Dr. Edwards has been preparing. And you'll be able to identify the 5 functions. For our second objective, you will be able to describe a participatory action research, which we'll call PAR, a method to examine the 5 functions. And hopefully you will contribute to the development of a supervision practice tool. And with that, I'm going to hand off to Rita Cronice, who will go over some of the milestones of this research endeavor. Rita?
Thanks so much, Geeta. Good job with the questions for evaluation and advocacy. So I'm just going to cover very briefly as an overview, sort of the project milestones that we went through as we did this participatory action research. In 2021, we started with some Delphi focus groups. We had 4 focus groups, and Dr. Spagnuolo is going to go into much more detail about the method, so I'm just going to hit the high points. In 2022, we took the feedback that we got from those focus groups and started to evaluate it and analyze it for competencies that were under each of the 5 functions of supervision that Dr. Edwards is going to talk to us about a little bit more. That feedback was looked at by both supervisors that had participated in the surveys or in the focus groups, and by peer specialists that came alongside and said, yes, these are competencies that I want to make sure I have in my supervision. Dr. Forbes conducted a thorough literature review at that time, and out of that we came out with 71 competency statements that we needed to kind of evaluate for just how prevalent they were. So what we did was we took those competency statements and disseminated in a pilot survey to a very large population the competency statements and looked at them for importance, criticality, and frequency. And again, Dr. Spagnuolo will talk about that a little bit more. Once we had the information from that, we prepared a manuscript that went for peer review. And at this point, we're awaiting the actual article to come back out, but we have been accepted for publication. And now we're heading into the next phase of research that we're going to be doing on testing this model of 5 functions of supervision. And I see, Jason, you have your hand up. Something quick?
Hi, thank you. Yeah, my question is, in the literature review, was that specific to supervision of the peer workforce, or was it more broadly kind of a more broad literature review?
I'll actually let Dr. Forbes answer that because that's coming up as a little bit later in our presentation. Next slide. So looking at the actual research question and the specific aims, we were very much looking at the 5-function model of supervision, and we wanted to see what the supervisory competencies were under those 5 functions, as identified by supervisors themselves and peer support specialists. So we identified perspectives on supervision from both the peer specialists and the supervisors. We investigated the breadth and depth of the supervision functions by identifying competencies that were associated with them. And then we went on to determine the importance, criticality, and frequency of those supervision competencies. And with that, I will hand it over to Jonathan to talk a little bit more about this 5-function model.
Thank you so much, Rita. Thank you, Geeta, for your presentations. And hopefully I'm not muted. So this particular model here, I would be remiss not to acknowledge, even in her physical absence, a former supervisor. Her name is Mary Lee Burns, who some 15 years ago or so encouraged me to take an inventory of the myriad roles and tasks that I performed as a supervisor. And she used to say, you should call your presentation Many Hats. And because my perspective is informed by a person who is in long-term recovery, an academic, a manager, a supervisor, a facilitator, so many different streams of knowledge and exposure have really resulted in the model that I'm going to talk briefly about. So what emerged from the discussion between me and Mary Lee during one of our supervision sessions, and I think I was probably a little bit surly because I was feeling a little burnt out and bored in the job. And so she helped to reinvigorate me by challenging me to sit down and to write about the different roles. And she said, why don't you sit down and, organize a table in terms of all the things that you do? And of course, I love tables and projects, so that got me excited. And what emerged from the discussion was an approach to supervision that expanded on a three-function model, which was developed by SAMHSA. And SAMHSA's model includes administrative, supportive, and educative functions. So the uniqueness of the model that we're talking about today is one that includes two additional functions that Gita asked questions about at the beginning, and those are advocacy and evaluation. So the model under discussion is displayed on the slide that you're now seeing. And to provide a brief example, I always start out presentations by saying with administrative functions of supervision, I believe that these really begin long before the person is fully onboarded, because it really begins with that recruitment process and hiring a staff member who meets the job qualifications and making sure that the job description is sound and it's reflective of the work that's actually being done, that it minimizes the chance for role ambiguity and for confusion between disciplines. I just want to pause. Can everyone hear me okay? I've been having some technical issues and okay, great. I see a thumbs up, Libby. Thank you. So the administrative function, as you'll later see, is a very broad function. I always contend that administrative begins and ends the process of one's tenure in a job. It includes other things, but for the sake of time, we'll move on to say that the supportive function includes things like building morale, inspiring excellence, and promoting wellness and self-care for all staff. That's an organizational culture piece and not so much based around making sure that people are taking their meds or doing other things that make them good employees. So this is a non-stigmatizing way of promoting wellness without saying wellness belongs only to a certain type of staff. Educative. That's explaining the big picture and providing context and value of specific roles that the employee has in supporting the mission of the organization, really tying the micro to the macro, really showing the connection between the work that one is doing and how it serves the larger purpose. The advocative or advocative, as my colleagues say, has to do with strengthening the practice of peer support by promoting its value. So the advocative function takes place within the supervision dyad between the supervisor and the supervisee, but also it has to do with the supervisor craftfully crossing lines of the disciplines and really helping to promote what peer support practice is and really advocating for the visibility and the value of the profession of peer support. And lastly, but certainly not least, evaluative. And I always like to say, and I'm glad Gita, caught the comment in the chat about the the praise, polish, praise, the praise sandwich, because in evaluative, what often happens is that we don't really know we're being evaluated until a year has gone by and we find out everything that we haven't been doing so well. And so evaluation should be an ongoing function. It's not just conducting a performance evaluation, although usually the evaluative process culminates in that. It involves addressing areas that need improvement. We use the word progressive discipline, but I always say that we're going to change that because it sounds very punitive. We like to talk about developmental, playing to strengths, helping a person to align their job performance with their professional goals, and of course, communicating and managing expectations with respect to job performance. And so these are some of the examples of each of the 5 functions of supervision, and later on you'll see how we've moved this forward into the research that we were fortunate enough to just publish on. So what I'm going to do now is to pass the baton to Dr. Joanne Forbes, who will summarize the literature on peer support supervision. And Jason, I'm sure that Dr. Forbes will well answer your question.
Thank you, Jonathan. And yes, I want to thank Jason for his patience in getting an answer to his question. We focused primarily on the literature reflecting peer supervision. In my own research, I've also scoured the literature about supervision in general, but that's a story and a topic for another time. We engaged in a literature review primarily so that we could corroborate what the literature was saying with what the folks in the focus groups and the review groups were saying as well. What's interesting when you look at the literature is a couple of things. The first thing that is most interesting to me is that the academic literature is very limited in terms of what it says about peer supervision. Most of the guidance on how to do peer supervision comes from the gray literature. The academic literature, it's of interest, and it should be of interest to all of us peer supporters because it gives us a perspective on what's going on in academia and what folks from other professions are thinking and saying and working with in terms of peer support and peer supervision. What is interesting as well is that when you look at the academic literature, for example, unanimously, it talks about the importance of supervision, not only in addressing all the challenges that peer supporters face when they're integrating into, already existing teams of other professionals. But what was missing from a lot of the literature that identified those barriers and suggested that supervision is the answer, there was never, well, if it's the answer, what do you mean? There was not that next step taken. And I believe myself and my colleagues have taken on that challenge to fill in the blanks. Because at the end of the day, the other thing that you see in the literature, study after study after study, shows that peer support is underutilized in many, many, many arenas, and primarily because of the barriers and the negative influences when people try to step into that role and join a team that's already existing. So literature is telling us a few things. There certainly are barriers and challenges to being a peer supporter, and I think my group would add, and to being a peer supervisor. And supervision is a critical element to overcome some of those challenges. And if you go to the next slide, please, Jonathan. The themes that emerged can be grouped into 3 arenas. The first arena is this role confusion. We just sampled this to show you. There's many other pieces of literature that talk about role confusion. And it does have to do with a lack of understanding of peer values, the core values that belong to peer support. We shouldn't be surprised about that because unless you are a peer supporter, you don't necessarily know that. If you're a member from another profession, how would you know that? You're not gonna know that. The other theme that is also ubiquitous in literature, and I will say this is not unique to peer support. This is the kind of thing that you see in supervision literature throughout the professions. There's little or no time dedicated to supervision. And that in itself is a discussion for another day as well. This is grouped again under that lack of understanding. What is it like to be sharing your personal story? What is it like? And what is that power? People from other disciplines who don't necessarily share their experience have trouble wrapping their head around that and understanding it, and therefore have trouble implementing it successfully within the team. Big theme in the literature on the peer side is peer support has not built a career ladder yet. So there's not a lot of professional advancement, and a lot of people leave peer support because of that. And this goes hand in hand with that issue. Without a career ladder, we see two things. We know that peer supporters are, say, underpaid. There's not the same kind of equity with the other professions. Lived experience and living experience does not require a degree. And as we all know in this country, we have moved in the direction of, I will say, my personal opinion, overvaluing education. She says as she went on and got her doctorate. Next piece of literature, please. This goes back to the first one. You know, not only is there confusion on both sides about what do I do on this team as a peer supporter, everyone has a different interpretation to bring to the table. Depends on the team, it depends on the organization. So there's a lot of ambiguity out there. And as a result of that, you see role conflict. Like, you know, that's my job. No, that's my job. Makes it very interesting. And last but not least, similar theme, maintaining peer values. As you are frequently a token peer, right? We know that when there are only one or two peers on a team, it's very hard to maintain those values when you're up against a dominant culture. And so those were the themes that we pulled out of the literature to focus on, and also to think about how they got corroborated when our focus groups spoke. So that's that story. And I'm going to actually ask Dr. Spagnola to pick up here and talk about what do we do from there.
Thanks, Joanne. Yeah, so I'm hopeful that, Jason, that helped kind of frame the types of literature we were consulting. Joanne also did her own unique research that she published on, looking at the differences between non-peer and peer supervisors. So we could also share the link to that at the end, if that would be helpful to folks and if people would be interested. But what we'd like to do now is talk a little bit about our method, which involved a multi-phase procedure, beginning with Delphi focus groups. And Rita keyed us up for this part of the discussion just a few minutes ago. So in phase one of our research project, we facilitated and analyzed Delphi focus groups. We had 26 panelists that were identified using purposive sampling. So this was not a random sample method. We specifically identified people to be participants in these focus groups because of their expertise. And because this was exploratory work, we really wanted to be sure that we had folks in the focus groups that had a lot to contribute so that we had a good starting place to begin with. Each focus group was 90 minutes, and panelists were supervisors of peer support specialists. They also lived or worked in the state of New York, and they represented diverse demographic factors. And if anyone is interested in those demographics, I can share those at the end as well. The panelists were asked a total of 6 questions, and what we were trying to do was generate competency statements for each of the 5 functions of supervision. So the term competency was defined as a critical work function or task. And then data was gathered from the panelists and analyzed based on responses to the question. The questions all followed a very similar format on purpose. So we wanted people to really think about the function, and the way that we framed the question was the same across functions and across all of the focus groups. And we asked folks, when you think of the term blank supervision, insert the function, what competencies come to mind? Very similar to the 2 questions that Geeta asked at the start of our time together. So we went through administrative, evaluative, educative, supportive, and advocative, so that we can get people's impressions of what they think of related to those functions and what specific competencies would they include within those functions. So we moved on after the focus groups were conducted, and we did an analysis, a thematic analysis of the responses. 5 members of our research team used the structured approach to pull out various themes that we heard related to each of the focus group questions. We used actual transcripts, recordings, and notes taken throughout the focus groups so that we can come to consensus on some of those themes that we heard. And from that, we moved on to the second phase of our project. So on that second phase, the 24 peer support specialists, as well as the 26 supervisors, were engaged in a round of feedback. So initially, we took what we learned from the focus groups and we shared it back to the panelists, but we also included the 24 peer support specialists just to get their perspectives on what the focus group panelists were saying, and ultimately what those draft kind of competency statements looked like. From there, we came up with 71 competency statements, which sounds like a lot because it is. But based on the feedback, we had to categorize those under the functions and be sure that we were representing what the panelists told us as accurately as we could, especially when these themes emerged from several panelists. So the last phase that we moved into before actually this phase 3 was completed was Joanne's literature review, and some of the findings that we were getting from a multitude of sources, both within the published and within the gray literature, were used to, as she said, corroborate what we were hearing, and also to see, kind of like in a crosswalk, how do these competency statements align with what the published and available guidelines were saying about supervision. So we had this comprehensive view of the New York State panelists, the peer support specialists, and the available literature, so that we can have a certainty, some level of certainty on what ultimately influenced the items that became part of our pilot survey. So phase 4 was the dissemination of our pilot survey. So we presented the 71 competency statements that spanned those 5 functions of supervision, and disseminated that survey really broadly through a multitude of channels that we had access to. The competency statements were organized under administrate, which had 22 items, educate, which had 9, support, which had 18, evaluate had 8 items, and advocate had 14. And what we asked people to do was to review those statements and identify their ranking of how important how frequent and how critical the competency was to the peer support supervisor role. So importance was evaluated by how important is the task to successfully perform the job. And so that was on a scale of 0, not performed, to 4, very important. Frequency was evaluated by how often does a supervisor of peer support workers perform this task. And that was on a scale of 0 to 4, 0 being never, and 4 being daily. And then criticality was evaluated by what's the risk for an adverse consequence if the supervisor of peer support workers does not perform the task. Again, scale of 0 to 4, 0 being the competency is not necessary, and 4 being there's a very high level of risk and consequence if this skill is not performed. So that's the description that was given on the pilot survey. And individuals were asked, like we said, to rank each one of those 72 competencies. We also collected demographic data, pretty standard to any of the surveys that you may see, asking people about their ages, their tenure, if they identify as a person with a lived experience, if they were a supervisor or a peer specialist. And all of that information was then also analyzed so that we could have a good understanding of the folks that did respond. So I want to just take a pause for the moment because I haven't been able to really look at anything else except the slide and some of my notes. I saw Jason, are the competency statements supervisory competencies or competencies for the practices of peer support? Good question. They were specifically geared toward supervision competencies organized by the 5 functions. Great. So at this time, we'd like to move a little bit more forward, Jonathan, to take a look at how the competencies were weighted, and I'm going to turn it over to Carlo.
We actually have a hand raised. Larry is raising his hand or hand.
Larry, did you want to unmute?
I have 2 questions. The 5 functions of supervision, it seems to me that what you're talking about are middle managers as opposed to line supervisors. Is that correct?
Jonathan, did you want to respond?
Now that I'm unmuted, and that's a great question. So we're actually undertaking several different projects, which is trying to help us to get at a reasonable answer to your question. And depending on the size of the organization, the nature of the organization, that could be true. In our work, we find that the functions are clearly those that would be performed by line supervisors, but some of the people that we spoke to, they actually had moved from a line supervisor status into more of a lower middle management. So I don't think this is necessarily like a static, are you a line or are you middle manager? I think there are really gradations. And so it's really hard to kind of isolate who would do these functions. I mean, in some cases, you might have somebody on a C level doing these depending on how small the organization is. So I think that's another factor or variable that we're going to want to look at as we move further and talk to more and more people doing this work. Hope that that's a satisfactory answer for the time being.
And my other question, I don't know if you want to answer this question now or if you're going to answer it later. When you have an all-peer workforce, by definition, nobody is a professional anything. And when you have peers supervising peers, what do you see as both the strengths and the weaknesses of that?
Well, what I'm going to suggest that we do, unless Dr. Pratt wants to answer this, is to move this question to our discussion section, because I think it warrants more than a quick and dirty, if you will, if you're okay with that.
No, thank you.
Great. Do we have any other questions before we move on to Dr. Pratt?
Really quick, and maybe it's not really quick, but it'll be quick for me to say it. I'm wondering, did you notice to Larry's question, in I'm wondering if there is a greater prevalence of supervisors, like frontline supervisors, taking on more supervisory responsibility in smaller organizations, and in larger organizations if the role of the 5 functions is more diffused. Did you see that, or did that
Don't
not?
know that.
Yeah, we don't have an answer to that, but it's really important. So Jason, one of the limitations of this survey in particular and the responses that we got was not only that it was around 100 folks that we had usable data from, but we didn't have a good sense of the settings in which the supervisors were operating. So getting more granular on what type of setting they're in, what do they perceive their role to be is interesting to me too, and all of us, I think. Are you a supervisor that does direct supervision, peer-to-peer or non-peer-to-peer? Do you have higher administrative level tasks as well? Are you in the C-suite? Because we found that too, which is interesting. So having a better understanding of who's answering these questions is critical to moving this work forward, because to your point, as well as Larry's, we don't know. We don't know.
These are really great questions, and they'll certainly be factored into our future research agenda. And you may also want to type those into the chat so we don't lose sight of them.
That'd be good.
So we will move on for now. And thank you again for the questions. You're really enriching this discussion.
Okay, so I was the one that was handed the data work, which I was happy to do. So I'm going to attempt to explain which of the competencies listed on the next slide were determined to be the ones most supported by the survey participant. So as you heard before, each survey participant was asked to rate each competency selected by the focus groups. For example, the competency discusses the importance of confidentiality. This competency and all the other ones were rated on 3 clinical factors, which you see on the slide there. Importance, how important the action is, criticality, how much risk the action might involve, and frequency, how often the action is performed. Each of these 3 factors was rated by the participants, as you heard, from 0 to 4, corresponding to the ranges that you see on the slide. Next, these ratings were combined using the formula, which you also see there, I plus C times F, or importance plus criticality times frequency. And that formula gives us a weight for each of the competencies. So each of the competencies was turned into a weight by these 3 ratings. And this is a fairly accepted, well accepted, and widely used strategy for rating clinical actions and procedures. So this is not something new to us. This is used in the field frequently. So in order to compare the competencies related to each of the 5 supervisory functions, the computed competency weights, again, the I plus C times F formula, for each function was standardized into z-scores. Now, standardization recalculates each weight into its difference from the average weight of that competency in terms of the standard deviation. So what we've done is we've standardized everything in terms of standard deviation, and it allows us to compare the different weights within each competency to one another. Now, to identify those competencies with the highest average weights, we arbitrarily selected those with a z-score of 1 or greater. So a z-score of 1 would indicate that the item in question is 1 standard deviation above the mean. And with a z-score formula chart, that means that the score of 1 or greater suggests that an item was weighted roughly by 68% of the participants. The competencies we identified by this procedure were actually supported by from 86 to 98% of survey respondents. So the z-score process resulted in selecting the competencies you're going to see on the next slide. Now, You need to be aware that using this strategy, the number of competencies identified for a specific supervisory function is partly due to the number of competencies identified by the focus group participants for that function. So, for example, while you see that there are more competencies listed for the administrative supervisory function, this is primarily due to the fact that focus group participants identified more potential competencies in that area. I hope you have a clear idea of how these competencies were rated. The process is described in more detail in our upcoming paper. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Carlos, for a really cogent explanation of the analysis. You really,
I hope so.
as they say, made it plain, as we say in church, and it was really great. I mean, I just feel like the learning is continual, and listening to you describe it makes it sound easy, which we know it's not. So I'm now going to spend a few minutes talking about those 11 competencies that were supported by a very large percent of the respondents, and how to operationalize, or not so much how to, but how we operationalize these competencies for supervision practice. So what you're seeing here are those 11 competencies. And as Dr. Pratt said, you see that there are many more in the administrative function category. There are reasons and also hypotheses that we're generating for why that is. And you can see the other 4 functions with their respective number of competencies that were scored at least 1 standard deviation above the mean, which gives us an idea of the percent of respondents who scored these highly. So, for example, we're going to look at administrative. And at the top, you see that, I think that message is still there, but my Zoom bar is in the way. And what we're doing is, we're presenting our research tool under development. This is under development and it's not ready for prime time, but one of the things that we're inviting you to do, which Gita will talk about later on in subsequent slides, is to provide input, and we'll have a mechanism to collect your name and contact information if you are interested. Again, this is in the spirit of participatory action research, and we're certainly not doing this in a vacuum, as you can tell from our survey methodology from the beginning of the presentation. So if we look at administrate, let's look at provides training for new staff. So that was identified as one of the competencies that scored high in the administrative function. And so the way that could be operationalized, and the purpose of this is, which is why you see the check boxes at the end, is that when you're a supervisor and you're sitting with your supervisee, this is a checklist, and by no way, shape, or form is it exhaustive, but these are examples of how to provide training for the new staff. And some of those might sound like assess mandatory and practical training requirements. In other words, figure out what the worker needs. Arrange their schedules to accommodate fulfillment of these training needs, which means they may need to see fewer people. They may need to run fewer groups. It sounds really fancy, but it's not. It's rather basic. Here's another example of providing training for new staff. Convey the agency as well as service setting policies and procedures. Policies and procedures comprises so much of the administrative domain, and that's one of the reasons why we believe that it's so large. We'll move on to support. Active listening, well, we hear that all the time. I don't know that I'm always doing it. I have to remind myself, and then I have to look it up. What does actively listening mean? So we have an example here. Check in with the peer support specialist to ensure understanding of their concerns and questions. Because if you're anything like me, sometimes you hear things, but those were not the things that were said. And I'm not talking about auditory hallucinations. I'm just talking about the discrepancy between what one communicates and how we receive it. Let's look at another example. Be aware of the potential need to redirect a peer support specialist or any other staff member to appropriate resources and supports. So part of the active listening is not just to hear and to make a value judgment or an assessment or to discern a need, but to also be able to move that forward and help that person connect with a necessary resource. We'll move on to educate. Models poise, listening, support, and a non-judgmental stance. Wow, that's a lot of $2 words. But the way that we might operationalize that is to demonstrate objectivity and open-mindedness when receiving information. Communicate active listening skills by utilizing relevant techniques. But I just want to go back to that demonstrating objectivity. Part of modeling poise is, and I think about my spouse and myself and how we hear each other and we make faces. And that's not really supportive, and it doesn't really go over well in supervision. It's not really morale building. And so we have to think about the body language. That's part of the modeling poise, the listening, the supporting, and having a non-judgmental stance, being mindful of how we receive information and how we show up in doing so. Advocate, leads by example through empathy, curiosity, and strengths focus. One of the ways that we can operationalize that is to make thoughtful inquiry, be sensitive, and avoid making deficit-based assumptions. Oh, maybe they didn't take their meds. Are things at home awful? Did they get into a conflict with someone on the unit? In other words, we have to suspend judgment, and we have to really understand and hear what's going on with the person and support them in problem solving, but not making assumptions and then running with those. And lastly, but not least, evaluate. Uses formal, informal, and situational specific approaches to supervision. And one of the ways that we can operationalize that is to offer feedback based on multiple modes of performance. For example, direct observation, written, and other means, because someone may perform really strongly in their face-to-face engagement, but they may not be great communicating things in their writing. And that's where we can sort of use that direct observation piece to bolster the piece that needs development and to say, you know, you're really great engaging other people and you really show some great strengths and you seem to be really effective. What are some of the ways that you might move that into your writing? And so the evaluation is not just making an assessment, but it's also helping someone to bolster their performance or make a shift in an area that could use some development. So with this tool, which is under development, we are going to have an opportunity for you to weigh in and to give us contact information if you'd like to be involved and you are okay with us reaching out to you. And you can see that there's a little note that says this checklist is under development. So we're not expecting anyone to screenshot it and to take it out and to use it, because we are developing it and we would like to do some psychometric testing and also bring this into our future research endeavors where this could be a more vetted instrument. So with that, I'm now going to pass the baton to Geeta, who will tell you more about the process for providing feedback. I see a hand, and we're going to ask you to put your question in the chat, and we will make sure that we come back to you in our Q&A session. Geeta, you are up.
Thank you. And I see Lydia has a question in the comments, and we will definitely, in the chat, I'm sorry, and we will definitely reach back to that. So I'm here to poll you and get feedback from the audience. If you could see or hear the competencies that were listed on the scale, do you find them relevant to your work? Okay, there's a question. Phoebe says yes, definitely. Aviva says yes, these competencies are useful. Anne, glad to hear this. Thank you, Libby. I'm seeing a lot of yeses, and rearranging them. Like we said, the tool is under development and we have a lot more competency statements that people can look at. And thank you, Vanessa. All right, we have relevance of competencies. Let's take a look. at the next question. So here's the money shot. If you would like to contribute further to the development of this research, please provide us with your name and email address. And the way that you should do that, I don't like the word should, the best way for us to capture that is if you go in the chat to the blue bar that right now says meeting group chat, select that and open a direct message to Jonathan P. Edwards in the dropdown and include your name and email address. So I will not be able to see this. I'm going to have to ask you, Jonathan, to take a look at your chat and see if
I am doing that, and let me see.
we would.
Yes, so I am seeing several names coming in already. I think we have 5, 6. Wow. We're gonna have another focus group. Amy, get that script ready.
I will. I just wanted to note too, Jonathan, as you're scanning your chat, I wanted to just reiterate a big important point that Carlos made, which was, you know, we selected the highest weighted competencies for the purposes of this presentation. And we've demonstrated how we're trying to create actionable items for the supervisor based on those competencies. Because what we found too is that we sometimes see guidelines, we see competencies, but we don't actually see actionable behaviors that the supervisor can be taking in order to really embody that competency. So there's, as I said, 71. You saw, I don't know, 11 on the previous screen. And so part of our work in creating the tool is to continue looking at each of those specific competencies and then breaking them out into behaviors. So we're in the beginning stage of that process. So just wanted to make that clear.
And with that, we like to reiterate that our research is exploratory. So we are on a journey that has been arduous and rich, and we are committed to continuing.
So while people are entering their, I would like to respond to some of those questions, but while people are entering their contact info to Jonathan, why don't we have Rita take us to the references, through the references and to the book.
Thanks, Geeta. I just want to do something really quickly here. As we look at the references, there's a reference that I want to make sure people have a chance to access. And that would be, and I'm losing Jonathan's E. There we go. Sorry. So this is the reference to the research that has been accepted for publication. It's been accepted for volume 25 in the American Journal of Psychiatric Rehabilitation. So look for volume 25 to come out in the near future, and then you'll see the study, the full study as we had written it up in our manuscript. As far as the references here, these are references that have gone into Joanne's literature review, really looking at supervision in general, and what we found was a lot of gray literature, but here are some of the research findings that were in the empirical literature as well. So this is just a list. I'm not going to read every author, but this is a list that you can access when you get the slides. And again, more of the folks that have been writing on the topic of supervision that we drew upon for our literature, you know, how we compared what was written in the literature to what we were seeing in our focus groups and our analysis. Next slide. And here I also wanted to just put in a little plug for a project that 4 of us have been working on for quite a while. It's called What It Takes, Wisdom from Peer Support Specialists and Supervisors. And it arose from the desire to look at national conferences, sort of like this one, where we have a lot of wisdom that comes into the conference from people that are practitioners in the field. And so we reached out to people that have been doing presentations at the national conference for the National Association of Peer Supporters. We reached 40 of them and asked them to contribute just a small narrative on the presentation that they had given at the national conference. We pulled that all together, and as co-editors, the four of us, Gita Enders, Joanne Forbes, Dr. Joanne Forbes, Dr. Jonathan Edwards, and myself pulled it together to create a book, which is a fundraiser for the National Association of Peer Supporters. So all of the proceeds from the book go to, we had all of the 40 contributors agree to this. We all agreed to this, that all of the proceeds would go to the National Association. And as of the last conference, which was in October, they had sold 800 copies, raising around $6,700. And if you're interested in the book, it's available on Amazon. So you could just Google what it takes, wisdom from peer support specialists and supervisors. And I can put that in the chat. And I will hand it back to Amy.
Thanks, Rita. So before we take questions and finish out our discussion with everyone, I wanted to just put one last question into the chat and have you take a look and share what your thoughts are. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the research team so that you have a good understanding about what our interests are. And if you have questions or ideas for future research or would like to share information on the work and research that you're conducting, you can reach out to us in any way you'd like. So you can screenshot this slide or access it when Share publishes the presentation recordings and the presenter bios on their website. And we can also put our email addresses in the chat at the end. But the question that we have for you as we go into this is, what are your research interests related to supervision? So we didn't spend time at the beginning introducing ourselves because we wanted to be sure we had time to go through the presentation and have the Q&A. So I'm currently an associate professor at Rutgers University in the Department of Psych Rehab and Counseling Professions, and I have a secondary assignment in the Center of Alcohol and Substance Use Studies. I'm also the project director for the Academy of Peer Services in New York State. And my professional interests are training, technical assistance, and research focused on peer support, workforce development, curriculum development and design, and supervision. We started off our presentation with Dr. Edwards, and he described his development of the 5 functions of supervision, which was based on many years of direct experience as a supervisor, a public health advisor, workforce development consultant. He's also a licensed clinical social worker. He's a certified peer specialist in New York and an adjunct professor at Columbia University School of Social Work. So without Dr. Edwards' invitation to join him in his continued exploration of this model, we wouldn't be presenting the content today. So we want to thank you, Dr. Edwards, for including us. Rita Cronice is a faculty member at Rutgers in the same department as me, psychiatric rehab. She's also the co-director of the Peer Support Services Technical Assistance Center, which is called PeerTAC, where you can find a ton of resources on supervision and more to come in the next couple of months. She's the coordinator for the Academy of Peer Services virtual learning community. She's also a talented instructional designer. And Rita is masterful at networking, connecting, developing communities of practice, and creating and sustaining learning collaboratives that have supported peer initiatives across the country for a very long time. Next, we have Gita, and she's the director of peer services at New York City Health and Hospitals. She's also the founder of the Health and Hospitals Peer Academy. Gita is generous with her time, her expertise, and probably her compassion more than anything else. Gita regularly provides consultation for public psychiatry fellows and conducts research on professional development and diversification of peer support worker roles, supervision strategies, and staff development. And Dr. Forbes consults nationally on system transformation and peer support service delivery, training, and supervision. And her research has been so influential for so many people on peer supervision. She's got a seminal work and publication in the field. She's the author of the book, Madness, Heroes Returning from the Front Lines. She was also co-editor of the book that you just saw, and she's a graduate of the doctoral program at Rutgers Department of Psych Rehab. And then finally, we have Dr. Pratt with us. Dr. Pratt is a retired professor and the former director of graduate studies in psych rehab at Rutgers University. As director of the PhD program in psych rehab, he helped establish this as the first doctoral degree in the field. Dr. Pratt is also first author on another important book that you may want to check out. It's literally the textbook on psychiatric rehabilitation. It's called Psychiatric Rehabilitation. And in his retirement, which is kind of a joke, but in his retirement from Rutgers, he generously provides his expertise and passion for sound research methodology and analysis. And our team is grateful for his involvement in this and several other scholarly products with us. So with all of that said, I appreciate you taking the time to listen to what we're bringing to our research agenda and our interests. And thank you for sharing in the chat what you're interested in. I'm going to turn it back over now so we could just do a kind of an open Q&A portion. If you didn't get your question answered, we'll go through those. And Jonathan, I think you're going to help lead this part.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Amy, for those wonderful introductions. I think they were well placed, and we wanted to make sure that you got the information that was more relevant to your practice first. So, here we go. So we are going to open this up. We know that there were some questions in the chat from before, some very good ones that were already asked. And I haven't been watching the chat as I've been running the slides, so I don't know if anyone's been sort of prioritizing the questions. I don't want to waste a lot of time scrolling through and trying to figure out and leaving people out. So maybe
I could go back to one of the, if we want to take them in order, we could go back.
Sure, Rita, that would be great.
To Larry's question, which was by definition, an all peer workforce means that nobody is a professional anything. So what are the advantages or disadvantages of this form of supervision?
I'd be happy to speak to that. So, especially when peers are promoted into supervisory capacities, or peers are doing 360 round robin group supervision, it is helpful to have a scaffold on which to build the relationships that you will have with one another. Some people may not, there will be things in most organizations that all supervisors must be aware of, things like evaluations or boundary issues arising, or again, advocating with leadership. So we're hoping that these competencies will further down the line when we are when we have been through some more model testing, we would like to think that using these 5 functions and using the competencies outlined there will help supervisory practice for supervisors and peer supervisors. And please, if that doesn't answer the question, by all means, raise your hand.
Mm-hmm.
Joanne, you're lit up. Were you going to answer?
Well, I was going to respond from another perspective, but I'm interested in the follow-up question that Larry has. So, Larry, if you can unmute yourself and respond, because I think this was your initial.
This was my initial question. And the reason I asked this question is because I've seen a problem in other settings, specifically in the defense industry and software development industries. People often get promoted to supervisory or managerial or middle management positions because they have really good technical skills. And really good technical skills does not necessarily make a person a good supervisor or management. In peer support, what you're dealing with are soft skills. You're dealing with people skills. And you're not, I was just wondering what you thought, were there, I mean, what are the advantages of that? What are the disadvantages of that? You mentioned having a scaffold. Could you kind of flesh out what you mean by a scaffold within which to work?
So again, talking about the 5 functions, it is my feeling, and I just, for full disclosure, I'm a peer who's practiced delivering services, and because I think Joanne might speak to her research on peer supervised by non-peer supervisors. To your point, which I was actually going to mention, which is that, and this, again, as you said, happens in all fields, people who are highly skilled get promoted into managerial positions, and then they don't have the skills that they need to actively manage people in a compassionate and productive way, which again is why, as Jonathan said right up at the top of the presentation, that he was tasked with concretizing the functions that he was providing in supervision. And so from this framework, we can build the competencies and sort of give people a leg up on just those skills that they'll need to provide supervision within an organization that has policies and procedures. And again, most do, from the smallest peer-run organization to an enormity like the public health system that I work for. There will always be some supervisory task that in which there is a power differential. I don't want to go off on that particular tangent right now, but since there is going to be an inherent power differential, we feel that looking at things this way can hope to bring that into a perspective for a peer supervisor.
Thank you.
I'm just going to jump on what you just said. And Larry, I think perhaps what I'm going to say is going to be of interest to you. So two things. One is, no surprise to say in my research, which was a qualitative research project about the experiences of peer support workers being supervised by a non-peer. The major finding, and there were several other very, very important findings, but the unanimous finding was that peers want to be supervised by a more experienced peer. And that makes complete common sense to most of us, but it was not what Medicaid recommended when they rolled that guidance out in 2007. So here we are today with that kind of dual supervisory structure. The other thing I want to mention is my colleagues and I have also presented a seminar that we call Know Nothing None. And the reason we say that is because when you actually ask supervisors questions like, did you volunteer to be a supervisor or were you voluntold? Your point is often cemented. People were great clinicians or technicians, whatever, and frequently they were chosen to be a supervisor. And so it's not that they volunteered because they had a skill set they thought could meet that task. It was because they were good at what they did. And as we know, frequently the nothing part is, other duties are not taken off your plate. So if you have a caseload of 1,000, now you have a caseload of 1,001. And the last piece of our presentation, none, is, what kind of training do people get when they move into that supervisory position? And so far, it's not a lot, if anything. So thank you for raising that issue. I think it's an important one, and particularly important for us to be transparent
Yeah.
about supervision and its limitations, not only in the world of peer support, but in, the caregiving professions in general.
Yeah, Joe, I also think that's something to be realistic about all of us, is that as peer support services are implemented in a new variety of settings, including very traditional mental health settings like clinics and outpatient services, the likelihood of having a non-peer supervisor is very high. And so all the more reason for us to help prepare people to provide good supervision, even if they themselves have not had the experience of providing peer support, which defies that traditional apprenticeship model that many of us learned how to do our jobs within. So we only have 3 minutes left, and I just wanted to check in with Rita and see, Rita, is there anything else in the chat that Jonathan and I may have missed? Like a question?
Jason has had his hand raised, so I'd
Oh,
like
sure.
to defer to Jason.
Sure. Jason, do you want to have the last question? No
No,
pressure.
but I'll have
pressure.
a question. Thank you. And it's more of a comment. It's a response, I guess, that I don't want to shy away from professionalization. I think it's very important that we distinguish between peer relationships that are community-based and authentic in mutuality, and paid peer relationships. As paid peer specialists, that's a difference.
Yeah.
Right? There's a distinction between the peer relationship in, for example, a mutual aid or self-help support group where nobody's paid, and a peer support specialist that is paid to do peer support for somebody. I think it's a really important distinction. So I don't want to shy away from professionalism, particularly in terms of supervision and how we create effective parameters for supervision. And I'll say as somebody in an agency that constantly has a need to internally promote for supervisors, we are always asking who could be the next supervisor, because one, we have a career development ladder that we use agency-wide, and two, people are moving around, and we need to develop skills for supervisors so that as we develop new programs, we've got people that are ready to supervise staff. So it's an essential need, and I think this work is really important, and kudos, thank you.
Thanks, Jason.
I'd love to jump in with just very quickly with an analogy that my mentor, Steve Harrington, used to use. Community-based peer support is like volunteer fire departments. Professional-based, the clinical-based peer support is like a fire department in a major metropolitan city where you can reach a lot more people and you get a lot more training and you get paid to do it. But, it's not the same camaraderie that you get in the rural settings. So I thought that was a great analogy.
Thanks, Rita.
Jenna, I see your hand and we have like a minute left. So if you have a quick question?
No, I just wanted to kind of echo what Jason said really quickly. I'm in Iowa. I'm a state board certified peer recovery specialist. And so I just want to say that we are professionals. I am a supervisor of peer support specialists. So all of my staff is trained. We have a state training that's over 40 hours. And I think it's really important. I mean, if we can call ourselves paraprofessionals, I guess, but I think it's just really important to recognize that in the workforce because we are doing stuff.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Jenna.
Thanks.
Thank you.